What I'm going to try to do today is provide a view of predictive analytics from 30,000 feet. There are, as you can imagine, lots and lots of details. I'm happy to talk about those with you. If there are questions, feel free to interrupt me with questions. You can argue with me if you'd like, that's just fine. But I'm going to try to keep some distance from those details if I can, because we can sort of go down a rabbit hole with them. I'm happy to do that too, but I don't think in this group, for this amount of time, that's the best use of the resources we have. So, we're going to talk about forecasting. I don't know where predictive analytics came from. It's still forecasting. We've been doing forecasting work in the natural and social sciences, oh gosh, since the 19th century at least. So the basic idea is not new. It's been rebranded as predictive analytics, but I'm going to try to show you that there's really nothing very mysterious going on. From 30,000 feet, it's going to look, I think, quite familiar. So let's start out with the general structure of this. And the real general structure is really very simple. There's the past. So you may have in an agency records from past families that you've served with information on their children and features of the household, for example, the age of the caregiver and things of that sort. And you're concerned about child abuse, and you have in your records, because you've served these families before, you have information on how the children in that household did. And you have that for thousands of households. And from the past, you're going to look for associations between features of the household and features of the kids that put them at risk, and whether or not they turn out to have child abuse experiences. That's just standard data analysis that many of you already know some things about and maybe have actually done. There's nothing mysterious going on. You look for associations between things that you feel will predict the particular outcome you care about. Then you make a very strong assumption. You say that the future that you've not seen yet is going to be substantially like the past. So what you've learned in the past from your data, you just port to the future. Now, family comes into your agency, you collect the same sort of information about the children and about the circumstances of the household. You don't know yet whether this particular child or any particular child is going to be abused, but you know that certain predictors are associated with that, and if a particular household has those risk factors, you're more likely to do something to intervene because you think the child is at risk. That's predictive analytics. That's the whole story. There's nothing else to it. However, this is from Albert Einstein. In theory and practice are the same. In practice, they are different. So it's one thing to be able to say we're going to proceed as if the future is like the past, but is it? And of course, then the devil is in the details. How much does the future and the past have to correspond, and in what ways, and how would you know anyway? So there are a whole bunch of details, but the basic structure is very, very simple. We've learned how to do this better over the years, thanks in part to experience that insurance companies have. They use what are called actuarial methods. Predictive analytics is just actuarial methods moved to the social setting. So you know the way insurance companies work. They have information on past customers. They know how those customers did. Did they have automobile accidents? Did they get a chronic disease? Did their house get flooded? They have lots of information about outcomes. They also have lots of information about the customers themselves. Where do they live? How old are they? What's their driving record? Do they have smoke detectors in the house? All these sorts of things. And just as I described a few moments ago, they associate empirically features of the customer and the household with their experience when they're insured. And from that, they're able to make decisions about how to set premiums for subsequent customers for whom the outcome is not yet known. Now, one of the things that's happened over the years is we've learned that computers do this very, very well. And in fact, they do it better than groups of people who in the past would look at those records and make a judgment about what the premium should be, and groups of people do it better than a single individual. This is important because it's well documented in the cognitive psychology literature. Very simple statistical models will beat humans in forecasting routinely and substantially. It's important because it becomes an argument often when you try to do predictive analytics with social service agencies and with criminal justice agencies, and by the way, business firms as well, because there's going to be a claim among some that they really know how to do it well enough or better anyway, and they don't need this kind of computer intervention. Let's look a little bit more about how this is done to give you a sense of what the computer is going to do. This is an example of a very simple actuarial table. In this instance, I have two features of individuals that the insurance company has worked with in the past. I know their age, in this case, under 25 or 25 and older, and I know their gender, male or female. Of course, they deal with hundreds of predictors, but these are two that are well known to be associated, let's say, with automobile accidents. So from the past records, let's look at males, let's say under 25. From their past records, they say, what proportion of these individuals have had an automobile accident? And they compute it to be 10%. And with a little bit of hand waving, that becomes a probability. So the probability of an automobile accident being reported by a male under 25 is 0.10. They then look at all the automobile accidents that these individuals have had, and they compute the average claim. Let's say it's $4,000. And then with a little bit of arithmetic, they can compute their exposure. Their exposure is the expected loss for this particular subgroup of people, and it's $400. And so they make sure they charge premiums in excess of that on the average so that they can at least stay in business, but then of course make a profit. They might charge $450. At the other extreme, they might look at females over 25 or older. 2% of those individuals have automobile accidents based on the historical record for a probability of 0.02. The average claim is $1,000. Their exposure is $20 on the average. You just have to charge a premium larger than that. That's all that's going on. Now, with hundreds of thousands of records, clearly it's not something you want to do by hand. Computers do this very well, and they can balance not just two factors, as in this actuarial table. They can balance hundreds, way beyond what an individual can do. And it turns out, for reasons I can explain a bit later, lots and lots of predictors, even if each individually is not that important, really count, because there's lots and lots of weak predictors. In the aggregate, you have a strong forecast. And big data sets help because you can look in particular small locations within the predictors that we call the predictor space, find just the 30 or 40 individuals out of 100,000 with a particular set of features and a particular risk, and take that into account as well. So computers do this in an excellent fashion. But of course, we're going to be talking about social service agencies and other social science kinds of applications. So let's sort of unpack this a little bit more. The first thing you have to do is you have to build the procedure you're going to use for forecasting. It's often called training, and it involves 3 steps. Let's say you have 100,000 observations to work with. This is your historical data. Take 50,000 of those at random, and you build your forecasting device. I happen to use machine learning, but you can do it with the contingency tables too, in principle, or regression, or whatever you're familiar with. Turns out these modern techniques work better, but the earlier techniques, which are much simpler, work pretty well too. So you train the data. What do I mean by train? When you do an analysis with historical data, there's a lot of judgment calls. So I gave you an example a few moments ago. I said we're going to treat age as 2 categories, under 25 and 25 and above. Is that the best way to do it? Maybe I should have 3 categories. Maybe I should take the under 25 and have under 21 as well. Maybe the over 25 should be broken at, let's say, 50 or 60 when driving skills are likely to be declining. Those kinds of decisions are hard to determine in advance. You do it by looking at the data. So you need some way to determine whether those decisions are good ones. So you have another data set. I started out with 100,000. I took out 50,000 at random. I'm going to take 25,000 out of the remaining 50 and call that my evaluation data set. And as I fiddle with the data, I'm going to see with this data set that I'm not fiddling with, the evaluation data, how well I perform. That's very important because it prevents something called overfitting. If you allow me to fiddle with the data long enough, I'll really do a good job, but I'm capitalizing on happenstance and other difficulties in the data which will prevent me from forecasting well. So when you fiddle with the data in your training phase, you need something to keep you honest. The evaluation data does that. So you try different things, maybe different age breaks, see how well you forecast, because in the evaluation data, this is my historical data, remember, I know what happened, and I can see if I break at 25 or 23 or 21, whether that helps me forecast accurately. So I go back and forth until I arrive at a procedure that I think works well enough. You never know if you could have been better. You sort of run out of energy. At some point, there are diminishing returns and you stop. Now you need an honest assessment of your ultimate tool. For that, you have the other 25,000 at random. That's your test data. You take your procedure that you now have refined with the evaluation data, and you see how well you forecast in the test data. These data have been locked in a safe somewhere. They're not contaminated by all the things you've done. They're pristine, and you see if you forecast well. And then you get an honest assessment of how well you forecast using data that you haven't exploited improperly when you develop the instrument. Test data are very important, but you need all three. This takes a while depending upon the availability of the data and how complicated your forecasting procedure is going to be. I should add that for those of you who haven't done much data analysis, this operation here in Sunsets obscures where the real effort is. You got to get the data in shape to begin with. In my experience, about 90% of the time that you spend developing a forecasting tool is spent cleaning and organizing the data. You just anticipate that. I didn't include that, but that's before the training data. Okay, so now you have a tool you like. Let's say you got a bunch of tables, or you got a regression, or you got a machine learning procedure. You're happy with it. You're ready to use it. Then all that happens is you have data that you need to develop forecasts from. So you have new families coming into your agency. You know what the factors were in the past that were predictive. You use those to make a forecast for that family and then act on that forecast. It's important to distinguish between the forecast itself and what's done with the forecast. I mean, sometimes a good forecast is ignored, sometimes it's misunderstood, sometimes it's used well. But you don't want to blame the algorithm or the results if the forecast is used inappropriately. Unfortunately, it often is, and often is just ignored. We can talk more about that if you want later. So that's the basic process. You build the algorithm and then you use it. And there are a variety of steps along the way. Now, in this training process, there's a really important distinction. No matter how I try to explain this, it always gets fuzzy, at least at first, when people proceed after this kind of material. The first distinction is that there are models. On Einstein, E equals mc squared, that's a statement about how the way the world works. It's a theory, turns out to be algebraic, but it's a theory. And very commonly when people talk about developing predictive analytics, what they're really thinking of is having a model of how the world works. That model is sufficiently good that when I apply it to the data, I can get good forecasts. Now that's great if you're doing physics. In the kinds of activities that we're engaged in, we don't have physics. We don't have chemistry, we don't have biology. We don't have the disciplines where the theory is pretty good, although far from perfect, even in physics. We have social science theory, and those models are pretty weak. Okay? So, what do? There's an alternative, and this alternative is dominating current practice in predictive analytics. There are things called algorithms, where Einstein is associated in the extreme with modeling. Alan Turing is associated with algorithms. Computer scientists basically invented the digital computer, and those of you who know the history of World War II knowing that his group broke the Enigma machine that the Nazis were using to transmit information in code. An algorithm is not a model. It is a computational procedure There's no statement about how the world works. So I have here the formula for a mean. That's an algorithm. Nobody is claiming that this says anything about the world. When you balance your checkbook, you're applying an algorithm. There's nothing about what you're doing which is a statement about how the world works. They're fundamentally different. It turns out that algorithms will often forecast much better than models. And the reason is that in some sense it's a mismatch. The theory is so weak that forecasts coming out of the models don't do very well, but if you just let the algorithm work hard on the data, it will empirically and inductively discover relationships. They may have no particular interest as explanation. It's not a story about how the way the world works, but though they discover relationships in sufficient number that they forecast very well. In the kinds of applications you're likely to be using, algorithms dominate. Okay? The source of confusion is very commonly when people develop an algorithm, they call it a model. And what's more frustrating is when they apply algorithms, they want to interpret them as if they're models. They're not. They're just formulas for computing things. They work terrifically well for forecasting. They are not meant to explain anything. And this is a source of great frustration. There are some things you can do to help extract explanatory content from the algorithms, but that's a second order procedure. We won't talk about that much today. Okay? So we're going to deal with algorithms. We're just going to compute things. So what we wind up with is what's called a black box algorithm. We have inputs, features of the family, features of the child. Is the child young? Is the caregiver young? Is there a history of, let's say, drug use in the family? Things of these sorts. You feed them into this algorithm that we've already trained, and out of the other end comes a forecast, output. We do not know what's going on in the black box. The algorithms can be quite complicated. I mean, you can look at the computer code and see what the computer is doing, but the implications for what arithmetic is actually being undertaken is sometimes difficult to understand, because these algorithms don't just take factors and combine them, they tear them apart and recombine them. It's like sort of the way heat destroys protein. These algorithms purposely pull things apart and then reassemble them in ways that may make no sense to us, but we don't care. First of all, because they're hard to see, they're in this black box. But secondarily, what we want is a good forecast. We don't care what the algorithm does as long as it forecasts well. This is another source of confusion. But what that means is at the end of the day, the gold standard is how well it forecasts. There's no pretense of explaining how the world works. We just want to forecast it. There's some interesting philosophical questions about that, by the way, but in practice, that's the way we proceed these days. So, what is this pulling apart and putting together? Yes? It says, for example, that you say that age is important. I'm going to break it up into 3 categories, give it numbers 1, 7, 15, take the square root, and then multiply it by gender. Why? Well, it works. Okay. And the algorithms do a very good job of sorting these things out. You can think of it, those of you who know a little regression, it's like sort of building in interaction effects and high-order interaction effects, except you don't build them in because you think on substantive grounds they're important. The computer finds them. And it finds all kinds of weird stuff. Okay? I should add, by the way, that I'm working with some folks here in the physics department, and we're finding weird stuff in physics that they didn't know. They're very excited. Because it turns out these algorithms, well, that's a whole other set of stories, but these algorithms do all kinds of things. I will tell the story. So the classic example took place at Boeing about 15 years ago. They wanted to design a better airplane wing. And they had their engineers working with the very newest in the way of materials and concepts from aerodynamics and things of that sort, and they came up with an airplane wing that was an improvement. And then someone said, wait a minute, why don't we let one of these search algorithms try to figure out how to assemble an airplane wing where all we care about is whether it flies well, whether we can anticipate it'll fly well. They turned loose an algorithm, and in a few hours it came up with a completely different design. and that design performed much better than what the humans were able to do. And it took the engineers several months to reverse engineer and figure out what the algorithm had done. And they learned some interesting things in the process. Okay? So these things happen routinely. These algorithms are really quite something. All right, what is the algorithm doing in this kind of application? We're not building airplane wings. We're trying to, let's say, distinguish between children who are at risk to abuse and children who are not. When we're trying to determine a categorical outcome, abuse or not, it's called classification. And let me just give you a very simple example with a nature preserve. So suppose you've got a nature preserve, you're in Africa, and this nature preserve has two kinds of animals, lions and African buffalo. They're both very large, they both are very aggressive, and sometimes they don't get along. The lower picture shows you a lion attacking an African buffalo, and the upper picture shows you an African buffalo tossing a lion off its horns. Now, if you're setting up this nature preserve and you're anticipating, for example, people coming and looking at the animals, you don't want those animals mingling much. First of all, you're going to lose some animals, but second of all, it might be dangerous and unpleasant for those who come to watch. So what you're going to do, because they enjoy somewhat different habitats, you're going to find out where the lions are and where the African buffalo are and separate them by building a fence between them. How do you do that? You might not have a theory as to where the lions are likely to be and where the buffalo are likely to be, except in very general terms. Grasslands are more for lions and forested areas are more for the African buffalo, but a lot of the habitat is mixed. Where are they going to be? So what do? You get a high-powered rifle and you walk the preserve. You don't shoot the animals, but if it gets messy, you can protect yourself. And you map where these animals are. There's no theory, just brute force. Get out there, see where the animals are, check a little map, and pretty soon you learn the location, and you can specify that with longitude and latitude. So if I have two predictors, longitude and latitude, notice there's no substance here. I'm just going to see where the animals are, mark them down in longitude and latitude. Once I have that, I can go back and draw a line between the animals if there is good separation. Build my fence. Again, just based on longitude and latitude and shoe leather as you walk the preserve. Now in the future, someone comes along, tourist comes along, I want to go see some lions. Where do I find them? Oh, go to the east, to the east side of the fence, west. Depends on which way you're looking at this. Go to the west. Is it west for you? Yes, okay. Go to the west, look for the fence, go to the west, you'll find the lions. I predict you'll find them there, and by God, that's where they are. And if you want to see the African buffalo, go to the fence, go to the right, or go to the east. I predict you will see water buffalo there. Sorry, that's the Indian version. The African buffalo, and you'll see them there. By God, that's the way it turns out. My algorithm was nothing more than walking the preserve and putting little X's on maps and then going back and figuring out where to place the fence. That's classification. All I needed was longitude and latitude, lots of hard work, and I have a good device that will forecast well. No theory, there's no ecology here, there's nothing about predators and prey, this is just brute force. And we're classifying into two groups, and once we have those two groups, we can forecast quite accurately where those different animals are likely to be. Now to abstract this a little bit, suppose again we have a simple circumstance. We have two predictors. We're going to look at a child welfare case instance. We have caregiver's age and we have the age of the child. And the blue dots represent children who were not abused and the red dots represent children who were abused. We're in the classification game again. We're trying to partition, in this case, the predictor space. This is our little preserve in our computer. Those little dots, you can think of as this is a three-dimensional scatter plot. I have two predictors and then an outcome color to tell you which the outcome is. And I'm going to try to partition the space so that the lions are on one side and the African buffalo are on the other. In this case, so that the children who were abused are on one side and the children who weren't are on the other. This is my training data. I know the outcome. I just got to figure out where to draw my line, where to build my fence. So that subsequently when I come back I can tell people who want to forecast where to find the high risk or the low risk kids. So I might just draw a straight line through it. There are statistical ways to do that, but the point is I just drew a straight line. I can do a sort of eyeball. And I'm drawing this line in a fashion that I make as few mistakes as possible. And I draw the line in such a fashion so it turns out from the data. I didn't have a theory about this. My computer said, you know, if the caregiver is young and the children are young, the risks are greater. Maybe I didn't know that before, but my data tell me that. And I draw my line accordingly, and there it is. Did I make mistakes? Yes. I have 3 red dots above the line. Those are kids who in fact were abused, but if I use this line to classify, I would have classified them as not abused. And I have 2 dots that are below the line. Those are kids who were not abused, who I incorrectly said were. So actually I did pretty well the way data go. Most of the cases above the line are blue. The vast majority are blue. The vast majority of time I classified them correctly with that straight line. Likewise for the red, the vast majority are red. Below that line, I made a few mistakes. One of the things about forecasting is there's always mistakes. It's never perfect. Well, never say never, I guess. But the point is that very rarely do you do terrifically well. But remember, the benchmark is current practice, and that's a very low bar to mix metaphors. Okay? All we have to do better is than current practice. Current practice is often so terrible, it's pretty easy to do better. These algorithms usually will. Certainly not worse. Okay, could we have done better? Yes, if we're prepared to use a more complicated procedure. We could have built, as I did in the example a few moments ago, a nonlinear fence. And that curvy line is a nonlinear fence. And I just set it up so I feel good about it. That classifies perfectly. All the blue dots are above the fence, all the red dots are below the fence. Now you can imagine to get a curved line takes a lot more computing and a more sophisticated algorithm than a straight line, but with modern computers and big data sets, it's no big deal. And in fact, most of the work we do these days arrives at nonlinear classification. So linear regression is not the game anymore because we can do a whole lot better. Okay? What do we do? Is there another thing we can do when we have more than 2 outcome categories? Suppose we have, unfortunately, homicide cases, we have cases of injuries, and we have kids who are safe. And I've colored them red, yellow, and green. Another thing we can do, rather than drawing a nice smooth line, we can approximate that with straight lines, but broken. So for example, these black lines represent partitioning, let's say the preserve. Our fences now are going to be straight and connected rather than curvy. This is another way to classify. It's particularly effective when you have lots of outcomes you're trying to forecast, different kinds of outcomes trying to forecast. We're still classifying. We have 3 classes. And with our algorithms, we might find, for example, that upper left-hand corner is mostly red. Those are kids who are at grave risk. And 1 yellow, which is substantial risk. And if you look at the perimeters of that table or that graph, this is an instance where the caregiver had many priors, let's say, for meth use, and the child is young. At the other extreme, the lower right-hand corner, this is an area where, in our preserve, the kids are pretty safe. The vast majority of dots are green with 1 yellow. These are for kids who are older, and the caregiver has very few or no priors for amphetamine use. So we can break up our preserve not just with curvy lines, but with approximations of curvy lines with segments of straight lines. This is called a recursive partitioning. We can talk about that if you want. And it's a very effective tool because it's computationally very efficient. But we can use other procedures which give you curvy lines as well. My point is there's lots of ways of putting up that fence between the lions and the African buffalo. But always the goal is the same, to find locations here in what's called predictor space, priors and age, find locations in that space where Whatever the outcome is pretty homogeneous. In the upper left-hand corner, it's pretty homogeneous for red. In the lower right-hand corner, it's pretty homogeneous for green. And the other partitions are more mixed, although the middle is homogeneous, pretty homogeneous for yellow. Okay? It's called recursive partitioning. Now, this is another example. I've given you sort of two ways of thinking about building that fence, either with a curvy line or with partitions. This is an example of a tool that can build either. I mention it because it's very popular these days. It's called neural nets. This looks a little ugly. It is really kind of simple when you break it apart. I'm not going to do that because it requires a little background and regression. But the picture is instructive, and I can lead you through the picture. I have a bunch of variables that are going to be inputs, X's. Age of the caregiver, age of the child, history of drug abuse, whether the caregiver is employed, and so forth and so on. I have a bunch of those. I then have an output that I care about, call that, in this case, outputs. We used that term before. And it might be whether or not a child is abused or not. What the procedure does is it takes the inputs and it combines them. And we allow it to combine those inputs in several different ways. Those are the arrows leading from the X's to the Z's. That Z is called what's called a hidden layer. There's nothing in that. It's just a holding station for this intermediate step. And then what we do is we combine the Z's again, weighting them as we weighted the inputs, so that at the end of the day we fit the data well. This turns out to lead to those curvy lines I showed you, or those different boxes I showed you. This is all the rage these days. They call it deep learning. What makes it deep is the hidden layer, and often we have lots of them. But it turns out for the kinds of tasks you want to do in child services, this doesn't perform any better than some of the more simple techniques that are algorithms as well. Notice this is not a model, this is an algorithm. There's no pretending that this is the way the world works, just that it forecasts well.
Isn't that hidden layer just like part of the algorithm, like the black box?
It is. It's just a storage place, so that if you know regression, I've got my fitted values. Now I take those fitted values that I've combined in several different ways and use those as inputs for the next step. So it leads to nonlinear relationships. Yeah.
In the same vein, is it a bunch of additional calculations that are happening?
Oh yeah. What's happening here is that I have weights. Think of them as regression coefficients for those alphas that are shown there. And then I have betas, which are yet another set of regression coefficients combining the z's. And what I'm doing in effect, think about regression, is I'm doing least squares, but I've got now two sets of coefficients that have to be selected to minimize my error. So it's a much more complicated, you just can't turn a crank. There's no closed form solution for this. It has to iterate. And it may take, well, depending, the ones I've fooled with, I can do in about 15 minutes on my computer. But it's not like least squares where you get the result like that.
Is it time to talk about why a creator of a model like this?
It's not a model, that's exactly, yeah. Algorithm, yeah.
Terrible use of words.
Well, no, it happens all the time, yeah. Yeah.
In my mind.
Yeah.
The creator of this is laying in these things because they're making some, in a sense, predictive choices.
No.
Hypotheses about this is a relationship that I think would fit here.
No, kitchen sink. Everything you get, you throw in. Hundreds and hundreds of predictors. Let the computer figure it out, smarter than we are. So yes, if you have those insights, by all means get those predictors, but don't throw out predictors that you didn't think mattered. I've been surprised a number of times. So the computer does a very good job of sorting that out and can handle hundreds of predictors. There's no reason why you have to exclude some. But if you know some that you think are going to work, by all means go out and get them.
If I use the word predictor, I was thinking more of this layer of essentially calculations. You've got your inputs, which I assume are not what you mean by predictors.
Yeah, that's what I mean by predictors.
Those predictors, yeah. No, I was talking about, sure, you got all this, essentially, data, right, at the input level. Then you have a set of calculations.
Mm-hmm.
Then within the box?
Well, I'm shaking my head no, because by and large, no, but there is tuning. So for example, I have one hidden layer here with 3 categories. Why not 4? Why not 2? Why not another layer? Those are called, you tune. Those are sort of fine tuning the basic calculations which you're stuck with. You can make them more or less elaborate. It's like before when I mentioned choosing the age breaks, 25, 21, it's tuning. This is the same sort of thing that goes on here. There I was still constructing a table, but I was determining some of the details empirically. That's what's going on here. So there is tuning. That's why you need training data, evaluation data, and test data so you don't get tricked. Yes?
If you prefer to talk about this later, that's fine, and I really appreciate your explanations there. I feel like I'm finally getting to understand this. But just to pull way back, when you talk about the training data and taking the data you already have, and I know you know this, like one of the chief critiques of forecasting predictive analytics is, of course, that for something like child welfare, given the over-surveillance of the poor and different populations, you're not getting so in other words, if we were to, and the way in which we define it, so if we define child neglect not just as poverty, but as not immunizing your children, we'd have lots of people enrolled with Colorado, Northern California, and suburban Oregon in the system in ways that would make them pop. So how can you, and I know there's a lot of recent stuff that's critiquing this for just those reasons, and how do we use this and sort of account for that argument?
It's easy. All I got to do better is than current practice.
See, child welfare data is saturated.
Everything is saturated. Everything is saturated with race and gender. Everything. It's everywhere. Yeah, and poverty. It's saturated, but so are the perceptions of the people who make the decisions, and we can show these algorithms are more fair. Are they perfectly fair? No. And, we have tools to reduce the impact of those if you as a policymaker choose to do that. But let me give you an interesting example from criminal justice. I deal with this debate all the time, so I'm very familiar with this. We know, you know, that the vast majority of violent crimes are committed by men. No question. True in history, true cross-culturally. We don't know why particularly, although there's lots of speculation. No debate about this. If you look at the criminal justice system and violent crimes, it's predominantly men. Take domestic violence, predominantly men. So now I'm going to develop an algorithm. And my algorithm, if it's a good one, should predict that men are at greater risk to commit violent crime than women. Is that fair? I have inequality of outcome. My prisoners are going to be disproportionately male. Is that fair? We can argue that. What could you do about that? Well, it's real easy, actually. This is what the algorithm can do. One of the ways in which we forecast that men commit the vast majority of violent crimes is by looking at their prior record. And my God, you look at prior records, and men disproportionately in their prior record commit violent crimes compared to women. Is it police bias? We don't know. Probably not much, because as I said, it's true historically, it's true cross-culturally. We don't know why. But what I can do if I think my prisons are overpopulated by men, inequality of outcome, put my thumb on the scale. I can say, well, I'm not going to count the violent crimes that men committed in the past as heavily when I make my forecast. And if I downweight those enough, by God, my algorithm will predict men and women are equally likely to be violent. And then my prisons are going to be 50-50. Is that fair? What I've done is introduced inequality of treatment to fix inequality of outcome. How am I going to balance those? That's a policy choice. And it turns out it's even more complicated, and I'll go through an example a little bit later, because it affects accuracy, and there's many kinds of unfairness and many kinds of accuracy. So getting back to the human services example, yes, no surprise. Of course, all the data are permeated by the way the society works because we produced it. Is that bad? Well, which things are bad? How are you going to weigh those? Those are policy choices. That's not for the algorithm to figure out. The algorithm can depict the consequences of those complications, but can't decide for you. Once you decide, we can do something about it. And as I said, the baseline is current practice. In the criminal justice system, I just got to beat the judges. That's a low bar. And in human services, I just have to beat the social workers or administrators who are making decisions. I don't know that field real well, but I'm prepared to bet that's a pretty low bar too. Because they're using the same data, right? They're using the same historical insights that they've had in their practice. They are as contaminated as the data. And moreover, they're not as smart as a computer. So I can beat that. That's progress. I'm reducing the impact of those factors you're concerned about, not eliminating them. That's asking for too much. Okay? We can talk more about that. Yes?
Is there integrity to using predictors that are at the individual level and the family level and the community level all in one?
Sure.
pot?
I wasn't kidding when I said anything. Now, we're talking about political issues. There can be pushback, and it's legitimate when someone says, no, you can't use race as a predictor. No, you can't use gender as a predictor. You can't even use zip code as a predictor because that, in effect, is race, and it's income. Fine. If that's the political decision that's made, that's fine. But notice, I'm not going to predict as well. I'm going to make more mistakes. For example, more African Americans are going to wind up in prison who shouldn't be, and more African Americans are going to be released who shouldn't be. I'm going to make more mistakes. Do you want that? Talk to the victims. Who knows? It's a trade-off. Yeah.
These tools can be used to look at like medical diagnosis.
Absolutely. They're terrific. They're being used, for example, in rural areas where there's not a lot of specialists. So let's say a nurse practitioner will log into a system, click in the symptoms, and get an algorithmic forecast of what the illness is. And usually they're pretty good. I'm not an expert in that, and I know there have been mistakes, but from what I understand, first of all, they're common. From what I understand, they are dramatic improvement. Used in all kinds of ways. Incidentally, that's a very interesting instance about race as well. Am I allowed to use race when I'm forecasting vulnerability to diabetes? And we know it's associated. Am I allowed to use it? That's not for the algorithm to decide. That's for folks like you to decide, along with other stakeholders. Okay? All right. Now, I've been proceeding explaining that often we always make mistakes, sometimes a lot, sometimes a few. But I've been ignoring up to this moment how you deal with that, because some mistakes are worse than others. In the criminal justice system, for example, I can incorrectly release an individual who goes and commits a horrible crime, or I can incorrectly incarcerate somebody who would have been a model citizen. Those mistakes occur. But those mistakes are not the same, and their consequences are not the same, and the costs, not necessarily monetized, but just think costs more generally, the costs are not the same. And it stands to reason that I want to try to avoid the more costly mistakes, and I'm prepared to tolerate the less costly mistakes if I have to make mistakes. So we need some way of thinking about that and accounting for the fact that some mistakes are worse than others. Now, one of the complicating nomenclature features of risk assessment is, think about lung cancer. When you're screening for lung cancer, by the way, they do a great job reading x-rays, these algorithms. When you're screening for lung cancer, a positive is finding a dot on someone's lung. It's not really positive, the person may have cancer, but it's positive in the sense that that's what you were looking for, and a negative is failing to find it. Negative is good for the person's health. That language carries over into risk assessment for humans in behavioral terms. A positive is usually finding something that's pretty ugly that you're looking for, like child abuse or homicide, and a negative is failing to find it. That's good. So I'm going to now carry that language into the discussion of mistakes. A false positive is having somebody who is actually at risk, but you treat them, is actually not at risk that you treat as in risk. I have to stop and always think about these terms as well. So you have, in this example, I have a false positive. I got a smiling kid. This kid's doing great. I falsely claim that the kid's at risk. I have false negatives. Those are kids who are really at risk, but I fail to pick that up in my algorithmic model. Those mistakes are different. You know better than me. And the consequences are different. I don't know which is worse, but I could bet that failing to intervene for a kid who's in deep trouble is a worse mistake? If so, the costs are higher. And what we need to do is we need to build that in to our forecasts. How do we build that in? Stakeholders, experts like you, determine what those relative costs are, and it has to be relative. It's 5 times worse to miss a kid who's in jeopardy than to incorrectly diagnose some kid as being in jeopardy. I made it up. Maybe it's 5 to 1 the other way, maybe it's 3 to 1, maybe it's 10 to 1. You need a ratio. In criminal justice, it's surprising, but you can readily get stakeholders to give you those ratios, and there's remarkable agreement. Okay? It surprised me when we started doing this 30 years ago. But a little bit of discussion is, it's about 10 times worse to release a killer than to detain an individual who would have been a model citizen. And then they can go on and explain why they think that is. There has been work in criminal justice trying to literally monetize the cost of those mistakes, but there's all kinds of things that we can't put a dollar value on, like the psychological damage to a victim. Okay? We don't have to put a number on that. People have tried. And I'm sure in this field as well, there are lots of things you can't monetize, but if you talk to people who are experienced in the field, they will give you a cost ratio. You build that into the forecast because you build that into the algorithm. It's really important to do that. If you don't build it in, what you're saying by default is that all mistakes are equally costly. False negatives are as costly as false positives. The experts in the field say that's nonsense. Well, that means you're providing forecasts that are not responsive to the value preferences and the concerns of the people who are going to use your forecasts. That's a mistake. But I have to stress again, it's not for the computer scientist or the statistician to decide. That comes from the policymakers. And it's controversial, but you got to do it. And at least in criminal justice settings, we do this routinely. People are pretty satisfied with it. Victims advocates, prisoners advocates, defense attorneys, prosecutors, judges pretty much agree on the costs of these mistakes, although the reasoning might be a bit different. Yes? A lot is known. The algorithms are smarter and they forecast better. But what we are very clear about in criminal justice settings is that this is information that the decision maker uses. This does not determine the intervention. We can debate about whether that's a good idea. I have mixed feelings about that. But let's say in parole boards where my stuff is used, we give them the forecasts. There are 12 people sitting around a table. They look at a lot of factors, including our forecasts. And what I tell them is, and I would probably say this in the human services as well, if in their deliberations about a particular household, you're deliberating about the very same factors that are already included in the forecasting procedure, believe the forecasts. But you may have additional information that is not available because it's not routinely collected or because for some reason or other it was ignored. Additional information, if you have that you think is important, particularly if the forecast is kind of equivocal about whether this is a high-risk case or not, use that information. So in the case of parole boards, if there's evidence of genuine contrition on the part of the offender, and maybe they succeeded in a job training program in prison, maybe they got a GED and so on, and that's not part of the algorithm, by all means use that. And if the algorithm forecast is kind of not real clear, which can happen, by all means use that other information. And then the humans and the computers are working together.
Right, but can I ask, are they informed about the variables?
What you can tell people is, what are the inputs? Sure, they must be, because otherwise they wouldn't know what was missing.
But is it the case for the parole board? For the
Absolutely. Yeah, you give them, here are the 100 variables that go in, and they're familiar with them because they're the standard stuff that is available from prison records. They know this. But they might see, wait a minute, you didn't take into account, you failed to record whether this person got a GED. You didn't collect education. Oops. So they get that information. That's a new input that they can use if they think the forecast coming out of the algorithm makes no sense. Our experience with parole is that about 90%, a little high, 75% of the time they go with the algorithm. The other 25%, they don't. And we have research that shows that we actually make smarter, peer-reviewed, randomized trials kind of thing. You make smarter choices using the algorithm, which reduces crime. Okay? So it's only one study, but the point is there's evidence that's all pointing in the direction you'd hope it would. I don't know about child services.
Do the algorithms continue to learn?
Yes.
Continue to
Yes, that's actually a research area about how often you need to retune your algorithm. The stuff that I have running in the Philadelphia and Pennsylvania areas, we generally recalibrate every 3 to 5 years. But that's based on our substantive knowledge about changing statutes or things that would affect the criminal justice system. And child welfare, I don't know how often you would do that. My guess is it would be a couple years, but it might be a decade, it might be 6 months, I just don't know. Yeah. Yes. I knew that, but I'm glad you let everybody else know it. The other thing the algorithms do really well, you've all probably gotten calls from your credit card company saying, something's happened, to check. And the algorithms found that, and they're very good at it. And individuals reviewing your records might not find it for months or not at all. So they're everywhere, and it's getting even more widespread. We can talk about lots of other applications as well. So false positives, false negatives, we got to weight them. So there's different kinds of, I mentioned already before, there's different kinds of accuracy, and that's why it makes these discussions about how well you do. Well, they do well in hiring. Well, yes, that's true, but you got to be real clear about how accuracy is being measured, and that's a long discussion. I'm just going to give you a suggestion about what some of the complications are. And the first complication is accuracy compared to what? Okay, you're shooting lots of arrows, you want them all in the yellow, but you're going to be all over the place a lot of the time. Can you do better than that? Or maybe that's how you're doing, and you're maybe comparing to somebody who doesn't hit the target at all. There's always a comparison. Accuracy is not an absolute yardstick. And as I keep saying, it depends upon current practice. Can you beat that? One of the ways people talk about accuracy is with the false negative rate. Okay? When the truth is known, okay, so that there is abuse, this is your data now that you know the outcome in. You can think of this, let's say, as your test data. When you know there's been abuse, what fraction of the time do you correctly identify it? Okay? Or you fail to correctly identify it. That's a false negative. And the proportion of times you fail to identify a kid who is at risk, that's a mistake. And the fraction of times you get that wrong is a measure of how accurate you are for that outcome. And it's common to have false negative rates, 20, 30%. That's pretty good. Okay? There's also false positive rate, which is the flip side. When there's no abuse, what fraction of the time do you fail to correctly identify it? Again, you know the truth because it's in your test data. How well does your algorithm do? What fraction of the time does it correctly find folks where there is no abuse? False positive rate. That's another measure of accuracy. It's not the flip side of the false negative rate. I can show you arithmetically why that's true, but take my word for it right now. They're different. They're computed differently, and they get very different numbers. You can have a false negative rate of 0.2 and a false positive rate, let's say, of 0.4 or 0.6. But these are two different measures of accuracy. The question is, when you know the truth, what fraction of the time does the algorithm find it? And obviously, you'd like it to be 100%, but it almost never is. I've never seen it except when there's a mistake. I included the outcome as a predictor by mistake, and then I predict very well. Okay? So the point is, this is an example of two kinds of measures of accuracy. There are others that I actually like better than this. But since we've been talking about false positives and false negatives, I've used these just to keep things reasonably consistent. Okay? So when you argue, is it more accurate? I'd go back to your employment case. I'd have to look at the false positive rate and the false negative rate, and then arrive at some overall conclusion of how well we're doing.
Can you adjust your algorithms to try to reduce, let's say, your false negative rate?
Yep. I talked about costs. I wasn't going to go there, but thank you for asking. When you look at this, you have false negatives and false positives, and you're going to have a certain number of each. And depending on how you weigh them, you're going to get the algorithm formed differently. So that if I make false negatives really, really, really costly, it's going to find a lot of them along with some that it shouldn't find, and it's not going to find a lot of the others. And that's going to change the false negative and false positive rate. So that policy choice about how you weight these things not only has to be included just sort of intuitively because it represents users' preferences, but it affects your false positive and false negative rate. That's another why some people call it a tuning parameter. And one of the interesting challenges in computer science and statistics is to develop shortcuts that minimize the damage done to the performance and dramatically reduce the computing time. Virtually all of the algorithms that you'll see in practice represent that. They are compromises because we can't do exactly what we want. It's computation not tractable. And the good news is that these approximations often work really, really well. But as we get smarter and develop better algorithms, those approximations become even better. But turns out we're resource limited in being able to look through all possible combinations of predictors in all kinds of ways with 300,000 cases. So we approximate. And they're good approximations, but they're not perfect. Yeah. Okay? Another issue that comes up, and you're starting to get at it right now, is transparency. The complaint is, well, these algorithms are terrific, but who the hell knows what they're doing, and I'm not going to put families into this machine without knowing what's going on. And I get this in criminal justice all the time. And the first statement is compared to what? Again, if you go to court and listen to a judge that sentences someone, he'll say, I've looked at your record, son, and you've committed these 3 or 4 crimes. I've seen people like you in the past. I'm giving you 10 years. And then he goes on to the next case. Is that transparent? That is sort of a little speech that the judge has to give in his relationship with the prosecutors and defense, with the media. The judge may be running for office. The judge may himself or herself not even know the factors. What about unconscious bias? if you ask judges at some length what their thinking was, they often can't tell you except by giving you kind of stock answers. Well, I balance the good against the bad, and I've been at this 20 years. I've seen hundreds of people like this, and this kid looks like that. Well, that's kind of an algorithm, by the way. But the point is that if, again, the benchmark is current practice. So if you go to child welfare, I would say when you have these particular decisions made, how transparent are they really? Sometimes they're behind closed doors. Sometimes it's a group of people. One strong personality dominates. What's going on? That's the first point. But if you want to unpack this, transparency has lots of components. One question was already asked, what about the inputs? Yeah, transparency requires that all of the inputs be included, but that in turn requires some sophistication on the users of what it means. We already had some reference to this. Supposing I have prior record. Supposing you believe that that's because of police bias. They disproportionately arrest, let's say, African Americans when they wouldn't arrest an Anglo committing the same crime. That's a claim. It's an empirical claim, though, and you can look and see. And it's complicated. Here's why. Police officers are deployed primarily by calls for service. Someone gets on the phone and dials 911. And they respond to those calls for service. If you look at police activity, about 95% of where they go and what they do is in calls for service. So you have some communities that have many calls for service and some that have very few. Not surprisingly, calls for service will come from higher crime neighborhoods. Those higher crime neighborhoods tend to be low income, often African American. So you have more police in those communities, simply because they're responding to what the citizens want. Hey, I need help. Got a robbery going on here. Someone's trying to break into my house. The police go there. When you have more police in that community, it stands to reason there are going to be more police-community interactions, more contacts between police and citizens. Other things equal, that is, the police arrest anybody if they see a crime. They're going to see more things going on when there's more police around and they have more interactions with people they can arrest. Is that bias? It's hard to say. The point is that they're there because they were asked to be there for calls for service. And then when they're there, there's more police, more interactions, and yeah, there'll be more arrests. Is that a reflection of bias? Well, you got to sort that out. That's what I'm saying, that even if you know what the inputs are, what they mean takes some subject matter sophistication. I get this all the time in conversation with criminal justice. Oh, police are biased. I say, would you know how police are actually assigned to neighborhoods? Well, they just go wherever they want, or they're assigned by their lieutenant. And they're, no, they go to calls for service. So it's complicated. Then why those inputs? This is a tough one. If you're required to justify them. That's why I go kitchen sink. Everything I can throw in, I do. But I will get pushback, and you will get pushback too, on certain variables that address sensitive issues. And they're sensitive because they're politically or morally sensitive. And that's not for me to sort out, that's for you and stakeholders to sort out. Should I include zip code as a predictor? It may be a terrific predictor, but you'll say, well, that's picking on low-income people. I say, well, but that's where the problem is. What do you want me to do? And you say, well, don't include it. It's okay. You realize I'm going to make more mistakes, more false positives, more false negatives. Say, I can live with it. I'll talk more about that. This is the tough one. How are inputs related to the forecasts? It's a black box, as I keep saying. It's not a model, it's a computational tool. There are other algorithms that you lay on the first set of algorithms, which give you some sense of the importance of predictors for forecasting accuracy. So you don't allow me to use zip code, my false negative rate's going to go up by 5 percentage points. That I can tell you. That's easy. If you ask me why that is, how in this tearing apart and putting together of these different predictors that I arrive at that, I can't tell you. What I recommend to folks who really care about this is that we do experiments. You want to find out how important race is? Okay, let's set up a simulation. Give me 2 identical people with the same values on the predictors. One is white, one is black. Put them both through the algorithm and see how our forecast differs. I can tell you that. So we can do focused experiments, and we do this all the time in criminal justice. Focused experiments. People in the community want to know, well, what about racial bias?
What about discrimination by income? What about, and so on and so on and so on. Person's been in prison, how much does that count? We can do those simulations. I can therefore link inputs to outputs, but I can't tell you how or why, because it's not a model. And people find that frustrating. On the other hand, this has some possibility of being somewhat transparent. If you really want to get into the weeds, you got to get into the code, and very few stakeholders are going to do that. Okay. Yeah.
So, but if you do this test with the race, that's difficult still for the stakeholders. Because let's say you might prove that race barely matters, like 21%.
Yeah.
But in reality, still there's a disparate impact because let's say you included zip code, and that's picking up a lot of the race. It's highly correlated with race, but once you included zip code, the race doesn't add that much. So even though in your experiment the race doesn't seem to matter, practically speaking, all things taken together, it might matter a great deal.
Well, that's the point I mentioned earlier. Any data set is going to have pervasive race and gender content. There's no question. But if you ask me about whether I should include a variable, I can answer that question. But again, we have algorithms that have adjustments for that content. We use them. It reduces the impact of those various factors, but you're going to pay a price. I'll get to that. And you got to decide whether you want to pay the price. I'll just give you a punchline. One of the things that can happen is you make everybody equally worse off. Is that what you want? It's equal, but you're all worse off. Are you happy with that? In other words, you make more mistakes for everybody, but it's the same mistakes. More people are going to be in prison who shouldn't be. More people are not going to be in prison who should be. But it's the same for men and women and blacks and whites. Do you want that world? It's a policy choice. Yes?
Hi. So little devil's advocate.
Go for it.
So I imagine that it's expensive to deploy predictive analytics, particularly within a child welfare jurisdiction.
Compared to what?
I'm not sure.
Well, that's an important question. Are we talking 5% of the budget, or 20% of the budget, or 50? Yeah.
But just in general, I'm thinking it's pretty expensive. So what about the alternative of improving clinical judgment?
If you know how to do that to beat an algorithm, people will rush to your door, as they say, or beat a path through your door. No, that's great. If you can beat the 30 years of research in psychology which says you can't, go for it. I'd love that, because then we'd have better clinical judgment and better algorithms. I'm not against that. I'm just saying I don't know how to do that. And while I'm sure it can be improved, no one has shown you can beat an algorithm with that. Yeah, Rich?
I'm just going to follow up to Johanna that since 1996, the federal government has invested more than $1 billion in the state automated child welfare system, which can't assist in any meaningful way with decision making, and which is so complicated and poorly designed that in 24 years, half the states have chosen not to become SACRIS compliant. So I think the money issue is a value choice. If people truly believe, which is bottom line, that predictive analytics was better than, not perfect, but better than the current way of doing things, it might free the money up quicker. One of the problems seems to be, and I've had these conversations for a lot of years, is they're not searching for better, they're searching for perfect. And therefore they're not willing to invest in better, they're waiting for the other side of the same coin, which is there's not going to be any perfect. And we know after 50 years of research on clinical judgment that 50 years of research shows that clinical judgment is no better than taking a quarter out of your pocket and flipping it.
Yes.
This transparency topic has a lot of traction in the criminal justice area around bail reform, like the hot topic of the day. And my sense, not being a tremendous student of this stuff, is that it's focusing on what's inside the box. And I just wonder, taking a step back and asking you, is there a traction to be had of a of a critical nature that would be helpful to the process. That is, to get a better system. Say, if we bought the premise that algorithms are better than judgment, right? How should we as systems and as leaders and as advocates go about judging the quality of the several of these? Is it at the inputs level? Is it trying to look inside the box? You started by saying you can't look inside the box. That seemed really odd to me because I'm assuming the box is built by people like you.
You can look inside the box if you want to read my code. That's the
I'm
problem.
hoping that you're going to go look inside that. I'm going to go hire you to go
Okay,
look at it.
I look at it and then I have to translate it for you, and we would spend some time on that. Yes.
Well, I'm going to ask you, hey, which of these is really good? Because
That I
I'm
can.
either going to litigate about it, or I'm
Yeah.
going to write a policy paper about it, or I'm going to go buy it because I'm a leader, and I need to know which is the better one, and how am I going to judge that?
Okay, we'd have to talk about how you want to decide better. So there's accuracy, and there's fairness, and there's transparency. Those are the three legs of the stool, and there are trade-offs. My better algorithms are often less transparent, but they're more fair. What's more important? You got to tell me. You'll say, and people have said this, I absolutely will not use your algorithm if you can't take me inside the box and show me how income gets translated into risk. I will
Is
not
it
use
not transparent because it's just too complicated for Joe layman like me
It's-
to know, or is it something other than that?
It's mostly complicated. There are lots of things going on. I can say, for example, I started to, well, this is an approximation tool. And you'll say, what do you mean? Well, I can say we're going to do greedy algorithms versus something else, and say, what's that? So now I got to talk about gradient descent, which requires some calculus, or at least concepts. And then I got to tell you about the fact that gradient descent sometimes works because there's local solutions versus global solutions. Then I got to tell you how we beat the local solutions, and on and on. I mean, there are people who spend their lives figuring this stuff out. So it depends on how much you want to get into the weeds. If you really want to get into it, you can hire somebody to explain, and at some point you're going to get to a moment when they'll say, you know, I know enough, the rest is too hard. If you wanted to spend another 3 or 4 weeks, maybe we can get further in.
I got there an hour and a half ago, but
Well, then you're an easy case. But the point I'm trying to make is that the decision to deploy this, if it's going to be rational, has to weigh these different trade-offs. And I have algorithms running now in a number of jurisdictions where they decided, considering all these things, they're useful and they're very happy with them. But I've had other jurisdictions, one in a child welfare setting, who said, no, it's too tough. We do a great job already, and I don't want to mess. Of course, we had data showing they weren't doing a great job already, but that didn't seem to convince people. Yeah.
So I think that's kind of part of the concern too, is that, so when you talk about transparency, I think what people are asking is who's saying what's good or what's right or what provides a good outcome. Right, and I'm not, in caseworkers, as one previously, don't always do a great job. We can totally admit to that. But when you're, something about having a data set and having a program that's telling you this information almost kind of like legitimizes it a little bit. And when you have a worker who makes a poor decision, there's someone to blame. And when you have a program that tells you something, like, who do you blame?
You're raising
Our
a
data?
really interesting question that is now being discussed in law schools around the world. Who do you sue? Do you sue? Well, wait a minute. Remember I said these three algorithms. By the way, I have insurance with it. But remember I said there's algorithms and there's use of algorithms. So do you sue, let's say, the parole board who used the algorithm and made a bad mistake? Do you sue the people who implemented the algorithm on their local machines? Do you sue the designer of the algorithm? Do you sue the people who collected the data that has errors in it? Do you sue the police officers who recorded the data originally? It's wide open. And you're absolutely right. Normally when we talk about important public decisions, there are people to hold accountable, at least in principle. That hasn't been resolved by the law yet, and it's going to be a while. It's complicated, and we don't know. And there have been a couple of test cases that didn't go anywhere, precisely because they didn't sort out the different places where people are responsible. And maybe you want to handle it a different way. You don't want to sue anybody, but you want to have a trust fund when there's a mistake, we don't sue people, we take compensation from the trust fund or something else. There are lots of very smart people here in this law school, for example, who are thinking about this. Tough problem. Okay? And then this is, how a predictive relationship is established. That has to do with, I get an output from my algorithm, but now how do I assign that output to classes? I've been sort of saying it happens automatically. Yeah, I'll give you an example. Suppose in my algorithm I get the probability that a child is abused. How high does that probability have to be before I classify that kid as at risk? Because I got to remember, I got to make a binary decision. Do I intervene or not? I need a binary outcome, therefore. Yes or no. I get a probability. What do I do with that? At some point, I got to draw a line, a threshold through that, and decide how high is high. That's that next step. That's a whole other discussion, but that also turns out to involve the costs of false positives and false negatives. So all these various things go to transparency, and there is absolutely good reason to demand transparency as long as you understand, first of all, clinical decisions are not very transparent. Can we beat that? And then second of all, it's not going to be complete. Again, nothing's perfect. You're going to be able to have some insights, and as long as you're prepared to work hard, your insights can be better, but there's always going to be some concerns that certain things aren't transparent. By the way, I should stress that at the end of the day, when you really get into the weeds, some of this is not transparent to the computer scientists either.
Has there been any experiment looking at the usefulness for outcomes in terms of releasing just, for example, parole? Will commit a crime or won't, or basically release or not? You could just release.
I did that.
Or you could release that plus the predicted probability. Do we know if it adds anything to the process to tell the people what?
Well, what we know is that in the case of parole, that if you provide the forecasts to the parole board or don't, it makes a difference that cascades through everything.
My question was about the.
Well, but wait a minute. But because it's doing better than the quote clinical judgment, you know that it's adding something because the clinical judgment's already being used. The practice is forecast algorithmically plus clinical judgments. You get a release. The other is just clinical judgments. The control group is clinical judgments. So we know we're adding information that's useful.
Right, but I guess my proposed kind of thought experiment was the control group now is like the algorithm saying release or not, and then the treatment group would be saying release or not, and furthermore giving you the probability of reoffending. So not just a binary prediction.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Also, is it helpful?
Okay, that turns out we have looked at that, but not in a great scientific way. We have looked at that when we ask users. This is another thing you have to confer with the users with. What kind of output helps you? For the parole board, they want red, green, yellow. And that's enough. And then I also provide a reliability. Remember I said before, sometimes the forecasts are kind of wobbly. Well, we provide a numeric way of classifying what we mean by wobbly, and they use that too. So if a forecast is wobbly, we encourage them to use other information. If the forecast is definitive, we say don't use the information. It's a way of not doing exactly what you said, but it's related. If the probability is around 0.5, use other things. If the probability is 0.1 or 0.9, go with it. But we don't do it quite that way. And that turns out to affect judgments, as it should. As it should. Okay?
So I just have another
Sure.
question. I think you're absolutely right about the sort of the users, what kind of output helps you. But just like with purchasing health insurance, it's very often not the user or the person who gets to sort of make that decision. And this gets to a broader philosophical thing. You research, your ideas are very elegant, and you frame them like a scientist, that they are yet another tool. But yet they are what I've heard and read, and I'm no expert on this, is that whether it's for criminal justice, whether it's for child welfare, the buyers are buying it because somehow they've been sold or told or hoped that it's somehow cheaper. And so I guess this is a broader, so what's our responsibility as knowledge generators to also try and sort of have some kind of influence in how it is used or not used?
It's a really hard question, and we've thought a lot about that. One of the problems is that those people who are selling that software are making a buck. The software is proprietary. You can't, transparency is impossible. They come in with very slick presentations. When police departments buy this stuff, they do just what you say, and we're concerned about it. And there's a lot of effort going in to try to educate police departments to get them to ask good questions. And there's a whole bunch of talk about something like an FDA for algorithms, in which proprietary software would be submitted and tested, and then the outcome of that testing would be made public while the procedures that they use are not, like pharmaceuticals. There's lots of other proposals out there because, you're absolutely right, the consumer may not have much guidance for these transparency concerns that you mentioned, plus the fact that people have a monetary incentive not to necessarily tell the truth. So it's a problem. It's like pharmaceuticals. You see the advertisements on TV. Yeah, same kind of thing. Okay, I know I have just a few minutes left. Let me just mention again this fairness. These are 3 kinds. There are about a dozen. Again, they're trade-offs. There's equality of outcome. Are the fractions of men and women in prison the same? There's equality of accuracy. When I predict a recidivist in the criminal justice, is it equally accurate for men and women? That moves right over into the child welfare area. When I predict for low-income and high-income households, am I equally accurate? Okay? And then there's also equality of treatment. I mentioned that before. If I put my thumb on the scale, if I tweak the data so that I get, let's say, a more equal representation of men and women in prison, am I then discounting the seriousness of the crimes that men commit? The answer is yes. Is that reasonable? These are trade-offs. There's actually mathematical proofs to show you that these trade-offs exist. And then they also trade off with accuracy. And this is one of the things I work on a lot, so if there's questions, we can get into it in some detail. But the point is, there's lots of different measures of fairness. There's lots of different measures of accuracy. There's lots of different measures of transparency. And the user has to sort that out. And they do it, but it's not something you can either give a thumbs up or thumbs down to in 15 minutes. But we've had plenty of successes. Okay, let me emphasize the trade-offs by going through an example I just went through quickly before, do it with pictures. As I said, let's say, well, this is actually a little different example. We know, at least the data that I've seen from that study I did in another state, boys are at greater risk for child abuse than girls, other things equal. I don't know why, I speculate, okay? So, you'd think, therefore, we should be more likely to intervene for boys in household than girls, other things equal. Is that fair? No? It's inequality of outcome, in this case, intervention. Is that fair? Is this gender discrimination? The data say boys are at greater risk. Can I use that and decide? Well, I have inequality of outcome. What can I do about that? I can downweight the male risk factors. For example, I can downweight the importance of age. Younger kids are at greater risk. Well, actually, for boys, it's U-shaped. When they get older, they're at greater risk again, but it has to do with physical domestic violence in a household where it's a little different for child. It's a mutual combat, father, son, brother, versus the young kids where it's parent or caregiver. But the point is I can downweight those so that I don't predict boys are more likely to be at risk. That in turn gives me inequality of treatment. I've traded one kind of inequality against another, one kind of unfairness against another. How do I make that trade-off? That's a stakeholder choice, that's not my choice.
If boys are really at greater risk, why is it unfair to suggest that you should?
I'm depriving girls of my wonderful services.
But
People will argue.
But theoretically, you have so many factors that are playing into your decision making in your algorithms that you should identify the girls that are also at risk by other methods.
I'm saying other things equal from what this is just the hypothetical from the data I've seen. We have 30 or 40 predictors, 50 predictors, still boys come in as a greater risk. And maybe because behaviorally they're more active and therefore more, who knows? But the point is, can I take that into account? I'm depriving girls of this service. Yeah.
But if I understand, you're really raising these questions when there is confusion or there's concern about whether one group is really and truly at greater risk than another group, as opposed to artifactually at greater risk.
No,
like
I'm
maybe
saying-
there's detection bias, and that's what's generating.
That's not what I'm saying, though. I'm saying there really is. Men, no question about it, commit more violent crimes than women. Do we want to have disproportionate populations of males in prison? A lot of people say no. I'm being a little bit slippery here. Let's do it. Let's do it by race. There is no question. No question in major cities, the major crime problem is black on black crime. No question. I'm not talking about stopping people for using marijuana. I'm talking about homicide. I'm talking about armed robbery. I'm talking about rape. I'm talking about drug trafficking. The big stuff where there's not a lot of discretion to arrest. There's no question. You talk to police, black or white. You talk to police commissioners, black on black crime. Okay? So now let's play this through with blacks and whites. You can imagine there's enormous pushback. On the other hand, this is an interesting statistic thrown in that debate. Some of you probably know part of this. The leading cause of death by far among young African American males is homicide. Nothing's close. And no other ethnic group comes close. If you draw a graph, it's off the graph. By and large, the perpetrators are other African American young males. If we relax the interventions in low-income communities, African American communities, we will arrest fewer young African American males, but more will die as victims of homicide. How do you want to make that trade? I didn't want to go there at first because people get all upset. But the point is, you can use gender and other things in the same logical way, but all the emotions get triggered as soon as I mention race. And it's tough. I don't have a good answer to that, except to say that when we're talking criminal justice system, we're at the end of the pipeline. All the terrible things that have happened up to that point have happened. It's a little late in the game. And the various inequalities we've talked about have already played themselves through by the time I see them. You guys, as child welfare experts, have a chance to do something early on before this horrible stuff gets going. But I think you're going to have to use, or at least think about race as an issue. Yeah.
Could you, in the little time we have left, talk about kind of real life experience with child welfare and
I will. Let me just finish. I have just 2 more clicks of my computer. I mentioned the trade-offs between different kinds of fairness. I've also mentioned there's a trade-off with accuracy, and that's what happens to the accuracy. Okay?
Yeah.
Bottom line is, you can't have it all. You're going to have to make the hard choices. Where we are in the algorithmic community and criminal justice is the acknowledgement you can't have it all. Technology's not going to give you an easy answer. Clinical judgment's not going to give you an easy answer. You're going to have to, part of the political, legislative, and legal process, sort this stuff out. The concern is that the algorithms are racing ahead, and the human institutions that need to make these choices are way behind. And I mentioned the example before about different kinds of transparency and who's responsible. Nobody knows. The algorithms, though, are racing ahead. And that's where I think a lot of the important advances are going to be made. Now, your question. I don't have that much experience with child welfare agencies. I had it with one statewide agency. I won't mention the state. Well, I actually had it with 2. New South Wales, Australia also. The experience was much the same. Everybody's real enthusiastic because the governor decided that there was a problem and mandated that something be done, and then trickled down through the table of organizations to the head of the child welfare agency, who agreed something needed to be done. And one of the things they decided, and they decided that many things needed to be done, there the concern in the state was child homicide. There, they decided among the things they needed was a better risk tool. So they got in touch with me, and I worked with them for about a year, and we got to a sort of a prototype that forecasted pretty well. But there were things that needed to be clarified in the data. Different kinds of deaths were not well distinguished, so that a kid who died of pneumonia might be misclassified as a kid who died of child abuse. Well, maybe they were if it was neglect. The point is, there were a lot of subtleties that had to be ironed out. So we went back to the agency and said, we got some results. Look, we're predicting much better than you have in the past. We can do still better if you help us. Sure, we'll help you. 1 month passes, 2 months pass, 3 months pass. call in. Going to help us? Oh, sure, we're working on it. 4 months pass, 5 months pass, and so on. They never said no, but they never responded. So then I contacted the people above them who said, we'll get back to you. Another month passed, another month passed. Then there's an election, a new governor comes in, doesn't have the same priorities, nothing happened. Okay? I don't know why the delay, but I've had that experience with agencies. California Department of Corrections, you ask for data, we'll get it to you. 1 month, 2 months, 3, oh, we'll get it to you. They never say no, they just don't do it. The other experience I had was in New South Wales, Australia, same kind of thing, electrical decision, person came in and said, we're gonna make this better, we have a problem. Again, started to work with all the people who were involved, we got a prototype up and running, but the data were incomplete because it was just kind of a prototype. And again, went back to get more, to clarify, look, I'm doing very well. And then eventually after, this was 18 months, it was a new election, new governor, and the whole thing died. I don't know what's going on. I have my speculations, but I wasn't a fly on the wall. I don't know why this kind of never say no, but don't do anything strategy was the one that was employed. I've not had that experience in criminal justice. So, and I'm out of time, is that right?